Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on Headless e-commerce. In our recent talk, I had an interview with Halil Koklu, CTO of LoveCrafts, on the case study based on commercetools and ViewStore Next. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. Today, my guest is Kelly Goetsch, Chief Product Officer of commercetools, the headless e-commerce platform for the future. Before joining commercetools, Kelly used to work at Oracle and ATG. By the way, he is orally authors of 4 books on topics ranging from microservices to GraphQL. I'm really excited we can talk on how the e-commerce technology landscape is evolving and why your next e-commerce platform is probably headless. Hello, Kelly. First of all, thanks for accepting my invitation.
Thanks for inviting me. Glad to be here today.
Awesome. Please tell us something on your background and what are you focused on right now?
Well, I actually started my career back in the day doing HTML for Foot Locker. So it was a summer job in university. And at the time, they were going through the biggest ATG implementation in the world. So perfect timing for me. And the chief architect at the time for ATG in professional services, he was just about to retire, and I was just starting my career, and he really mentored me in ATG, and I started doing JSPs, and then I started doing servlets, and then I worked my way all the way back to database. And then I went to work for ATG, and I just love the commerce space. I did, 30 something implementations, launched a lot of the larger e-commerce properties in the US. And it was great. It was just a good opportunity to get in on the ground floor of the commerce space in the US. And then I ended up with Walmart in Brisbane, California. So this is Walmart Global E-commerce. And that was ATG's largest customer. And they did 12 implementations. So I was responsible for those around the world. And that was a really great experience. But, after that, my wife and I had we got married and we had a child, which was great. But I realized I couldn't be traveling every single day of every single week. Often to some crazy place. So I needed a real job. And it ended up going to work for Oracle, which had acquired ATG, but I didn't go in that group. And they were building a product management group for some of their newer cloud products. So I got to spend a lot of time there doing cloud. I wrote e-commerce in the cloud for O'Reilly then in 2013. And then my last year at Oracle, I was responsible for microservices there. And I really loved microservices. That was a really big eye-opener for me. And I looked back to my ATG days and I thought, wow, think of how great it would have been if we had microservices back then. It would have completely changed the architecture. And I was looking for a company that met those 3 things in my background. So e-commerce and cloud and microservices. And I Googled it, and commercetools came up as 8 of the top 10 search results. And I thought, who the hell are these guys? I've never heard of them before. Because at the time it was a 90-person company. We weren't on any of these analyst reports. It was a pretty small company at the time, very German-focused company. And I ended up having a dinner with Dirk, the CEO, and I've been with the company for 4 years. So I'd love to be able to sit at the intersection of commerce cloud and microservices.
That sounds really awesome, great story. It seems like you were always first to fight, first to new technologies. ATG, one of the first e-commerce platforms back then in early 2000s. Oracle microservices in 2011 or something. We will get back to that because I'm really curious what did it mean microservice back then. Maybe let me share the story with your persona. So I first had a chance to know you around 2016-17 when you published your book Microservices for Modern E-commerce. I guess it wasn't your first book.
No. There was a summer there at Oracle. I was kind of bored, to be honest with you, because we had launched a product but hadn't yet seen a lot of uptick. This was Exalogic, and it was fine. I was keeping busy, but I was intellectually bored, and I'd always wanted to write a book. And I ended up pitching to O'Reilly, and they accepted the proposal. And I wrote it. I took off a bunch of time and I sat down and I wrote it. So that was a good experience. And it was also kind of nice because when you're writing something and you need quotes from people, they will do it. I ended up talking to like Jeff Dean from Google, the famous Jeff Dean.
Whoa.
And all of a sudden, he's, I'd love to be quoted in your book. How can I help? And I got some great quotes from him. And that was a really good experience for me.
I have the same with those interviews. A chance to meet really cool people like you and Halil before. So it really works. If you ask people for some advices, for knowledge, it's great to build a network. That's true. What I really liked in this microservices book is that you started from the organization point of view. So it's something pretty unusual, because usually microservices is about some JavaScript, whatever technology you have in there. And you started with the organization, that the microservices is based on the team structures. The whole organization must adopt. Do you think that this team structure is an important success factor in implementing the service-based architecture?
I think it's the important success factor, because I've spent a lot of time in really big companies like Walmart and Oracle, right? And these are each 100,000 person plus companies. And it was remarkable just how layered the organizations were. So I don't know how philosophical you want me to get here, but back in the day, if you wanted to set up a database, you had to have a team of very highly skilled DBAs to do that.
Yeah.
And then you would build a DBA group, and they would own the database, and they didn't want pesky developers like me touching their pretty database. And that's how it used to be. So, if I was at a bigger company and I wanted to get a column added to a database table, right, like that was a really easy thing for me to do personally. If I had access to the database, that's a 5-second change. But in a big enterprise, you have to go through a whole change request process, right? You have to fill out a whole bunch of paperwork. And then they take the request, they implement it in a development environment, and then they give you access to the environment. And then, of course, your access never actually works.
Yeah, it takes forever.
And then you have to verify it. And they have some stupid system that they use to manage their work, where you have to mark it as done in the workflow.
Yeah.
And then they promote it to QA, and then they promote it to production. And that's why you end up having all of these project managers, because all you're doing is coordinating the work across horizontal teams. So to take a feature from, if I'm a middle tier developer, adding maybe I want to start capturing the customer's birth date. If I had full access to that whole stack, that's a 5-minute change, right? I go to the database, I have the table, I go to the ORM, I expose that property. I go to my mid-tier code where you capture the registration information. I add it there to the form handler, whatever it is. And then I go to my UI, multiple UIs, and I just simply add it, right? That's really, really easy if you had access to the whole stack. But you don't have access in those big environments. And that could take 6, 9, 12 months to make a stupid change like that. And that was really frustrating to me. It's really frustrating, because if it's a developer, I don't want to get stuck in these big workflows. I want to get shit done, right? I want to work, because that's what I do. And with microservices, you're building teams that are focusing on a business domain, and then you're allowing them to use technology to solve those specific problems. And with cloud today, you can do that, because now you don't need a team of DBAs. You don't need a team of network admins. You can just go to public cloud.
Yeah.
Right. And it's really easy if I'm a team of 7 people and I'm tasked with inventory for the whole company, or I'm tasked with a customer profile, to just make whatever changes I want in my stack. And then to the world, I expose my single REST API. And that makes it really easy, because now I have a front door basically from what I'm doing. And then everything else is an implementation detail. So I think everything stems from the organization. And actually, Melvin Conway in 1958 came up with, it was later coined Conway's Law, but it's that the software reflects the organization structure that produced it. And the old joke back then was, if you have 7 teams working on a compiler, you'll end up with a 7-pass compiler, because
that's a classic, right? 1958. So still so true. Let's go back, maybe not 70 years back, but 10 years from now. So I guess you work as a consultant for Walmart back then joined the Oracle as a product manager. You already answered to the question I had a little bit. The question was, what was the microservice back then in 2011, and how did the e-commerce look like back? I mean, the e-commerce projects, the implementation project, how did they look back then?
Yeah, there wasn't really microservices. It was really 2015 when we started microservices at Oracle. But 2011, it didn't really exist as a product, as a company. I mean, Docker really wasn't even a thing, back then. Not that you need Docker, but that just kind of shows the state of technology back then. Is we didn't even really have containers. Microservices really started mid 2000s in Amazon, and that was actually a mandate from Jeff Bezos, where he said every service must have a well-defined interface. The technology doesn't matter. It must be externalizable, meaning it must be able to be consumed by third parties. And he had a whole manifesto he published and iterated on. But I think that's really where modern microservices came from. And then later in 2013, roughly, is when the name microservices actually started to be used. That's when books started to come out. That was when it really became a thing. And commerce back then, and even to today, I mean, with the exception of commercetools, it's still very much frozen in the late 90s and early 2000s. So you have single large Java EE applications. The source code is there. It's packaged up in jar files. You have extensions that you put on top of it. It's connected to a relational database. And then you have to deploy and manage that whole stack. And they have these cloud offerings, quote unquote, but they're not cloud. It's just hosted, right? It's taking an application and them hosting it for you. For a while at commercetools, we actually had a marketing campaign called "Is Your Commerce Platform Fake New?" instead of fake news. And that was a pretty successful campaign from what I've heard, and it really stuck with people. So yeah, it was a different story back then.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and I totally agree with you. Like, the hosting environments changed to clouds, but the platforms not so much. Like, not all of them. No, that's for sure. So before we get into more technical discussion, to just be on the same page with our listeners, maybe we define like how you get the microservice today. Like, what's the definition for you for the microservice? Is like service giving you like date and time, because this kind of examples you can find in the in the books on microservices.
I'd say it's small teams, roughly 5 to 10 people, give or take. I think 7 is about the optimal team size. They are cross-functional, right? So there are people who do middle tier development, who do back-end operations work. You have a product manager, and they're all working together as a single team to solve a specific granular business problem. And to the world that they expose, typically a REST API. They also have access and ownership, complete ownership of their data, of their database. So in other words, you can't bypass their API and read from their database. The only way you get things out or in is through their well-defined APIs.
Gotcha.
And then, a few other things. If you can build and release a microservice independently, I think those are also 2 hallmarks of actual microservices, because, you don't want to have 50 microservices, but then all have to coordinate on when you build and release, right? Because that's not microservices. That's just I don't know what you'd call that, but it wouldn't be good.
I think that this separation of concerns, loose coupling, the way you can deploy the services is what defines them. For me, it's one of the most important features. That they can be developed on different paces regarding the team requirements, the user requirements. Cool. Let's go into migrations, upgrading to microservices architecture, the topic which is I guess pretty important for our listeners, because If you are a successful e-commerce today, it means you started back then some years ago, and you have some reasons to migrate. So sometimes when I spoke to CTOs of the companies that started in the e-commerce journey in early 2000s, so the times where the ATG was the e-commerce sling, I guess, they were saying something like, we started where there was like one or two platforms to pick, IBM, ATG. So we had to build a lot of systems around those platforms, and it's 10 or 15 years of history of building those systems, exchanging XMLs, running raw SQL queries on bare metal mainframe-like servers. And now the architecture is total mess. It's 50 plus different services, and we need to upgrade, streamline this architecture somehow. Do you think that this SOA, so service-oriented architecture, is a way to do this upgrade gradually? Like, why do they pick this way, like going headless, going microservices?
So there's SOA in terms of concept, there's SOA in terms of practice. And in practice, SOA generally fails pretty spectacularly. And I'm not a fan of SOA. So the whole point of SOA was almost like a precursor to microservices. And the thought there is, if you have all of these different APIs, so whether they're REST APIs or SOAP APIs or databases or whatever they are, the whole concept is you'd go to a service bus and you'd plug them all in, and then you can access whatever you want from that bus, which makes sense philosophically. The challenge you end up with is that thing, that SOA layer, then becomes very, very tightly coupled to all of the services on which it relies.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So it's a tight coupling. It's not a loose coupling. And you end up with having to change the CRM and the ERP and the OMS and the commerce platform, and then the SOA system all at the exact same time, because they all have so many complex interdependencies.
Yeah.
And that becomes really difficult. So you end up with basically a monolith in your pipes. And that was always the problem with SOA. Let me see if I get this quote right. I don't know who came up with it, but I've always liked it. It's with SOA, you have dumb endpoints and smart pipes. With microservices, you have dumb smart endpoints and dumb pipes.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we want with microservices, is we want the pipes just to be plain old REST, HTTP web services, just RESTful web services. We want them to be as dumb as possible, and then have the intelligence all be in the individual endpoints. And with SOA, it's the complete opposite. It's all of there's transformation logic and all sorts of business logic that you put in the pipes. And I think that leads to a lot of coupling, which leads to slowdowns, which leads to spaghetti code that takes decades to unravel.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. So it's still pretty monolithic, right? It's a kind of facade with the services over one or many different platforms, but still very coupled together. You can deploy
what it is, it's the equivalent of like welding together a bunch of big legacy applications. And that's the very last thing you want, is for those to be welded together.
Yeah.
You want them to evolve independently and not have all those complex interdependencies.
So I think that we have also the second segment of the companies and CTOs thinking on the migration toward headless architecture, microservices. And I guess that they are the guys who started a little bit later, around 2008, 2010, maybe later even, picking some, I name it like all-inclusive platform, like Hybris, Magento, or some others. So the platform that have all the features, the CMS, OMS, PIM, everything with the front end, everything included, so you can just run it out of the box. In theory, right? In practice, it's totally different. But this is how they get into this situation, and why they are getting out of this situation. So what are the reasons they are thinking on headless? what's your experience of talking with those guys, like with the CTOs?
Until very recently, until us, basically, all of the commerce platforms were very suite focused. And that was because back when you were just getting online for the very first time, right? And this was, the early 2000s, typically the 2000s, right? If you're a shoe retailer and you have 500 shoe stores and you want to start selling online, which is great, you needed a platform. You didn't have a lot of maturity, and you needed a platform that did a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
And if you look at ATG, if you look at Hybris, if you look at IBM WebSphere Commerce, Demandware, Magento, all of those products, they had lots of functionality, which at the time was absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
So they had very lightweight CMSs. So they did the front end. They had an OMS. They had inventory management, right? They had all of these things. They had little things like A/B testing, which today is crazy because that's all very that's custom, right? That's a third-party app now. You never rely on that in a suite. So what they did is they implemented basically these products as intended, which is with a head on them. Hybris has a whole management layer for UI, and I think what they realized is that over time there are a lot of websites started to look the exact same, right? And touch points started to look the same. And to differentiate yourselves in today's market, if you're not selling a commodity good, you have to differentiate on experience, right? People just don't go buy a $5,000 jacket, from some luxury retailer because it has the best cashmere in it, right? They buy it because of the brand association, because of the relationship to the brand, because of imagery, marketing, right? All of those things. And you can't do that if you have a really lightweight CMS like you'd find in Hybris or Magento, right? You can't deliver that experience. You end up with cookie cutter websites. And yeah, maybe you can change the CSS a little bit here and there, but you're not fundamentally changing the relationship with the customer. So they've all started to go headless. And we actually don't sell to customers unless they've gone headless already. That's one of the prerequisites for using commercetools, because then you can swap out the back end.
Yeah, I have a question on this, like on the front end, but a little bit later. But what you said is something I already heard a few times. The opinion that the e-commerce platforms are getting more from the feature-driven to architecture-driven. Do you agree with that? Like the architecture-driven. I like this.
I do.
This concept. Yeah.
Well, it used to be if you were an enterprise and you wanted to buy software, you'd have to call up Oracle or IBM or SAP, and you'd go through a very lengthy evaluation process. And then you'd get the software, and then you'd have to find someone to host and manage that software. Like there was a lot of work. You had to pay upfront for the software.
Yeah.
It was a big deal to go out and procure and spend $3, $4, $5 million and buy software that does something, right?
Yeah.
Today, cloud has completely changed that because you have vendors like us. You have search vendors, you have OMS, you have 1,000 of these vendors. Some of them do really small things like, I don't know, there's one vendor I saw that does standard date formatting specifications. So you feed it any date and then you specify the format and it'll get the date back that you want, which turns out to be a surprisingly difficult challenge to solve. If you have a bunch of random free text. So it's really easy now if you're a retailer or an enterprise, some sort, and you want a new function that does something, go out on the open market, look at the marketplaces on GCP or Azure or AWS, pick something and try it. And all of these have API interfaces. And all of them, you can typically do a free demo. All of them are pay per month. So you might pay $5,000 a month for A/B testing, but if it doesn't work after 2 months, who cares? You've spent $10,000. That's it, right? And you get to play with it and try it. So now with commerce, we see the same thing, which is a great unbundling, and you use us as commerce tools for just the commerce part. And we're really happy to do just e-commerce, and we do it really, really well. And that's our goal. And then if you want something beyond our basic search, you can do that. If you want a real OMS, we don't do that. So you have to go out and buy something. And that's fine. And you end up with, you have to rely on a good SI, like you guys, or, go out and find someone, but you need a good SI to pull it all together. And then you build your stack, and it's really easy. I'm not going to say
Yeah,
it's really easy, but it's a lot easier than it ever used to be. Let's put it that way.
yeah, exactly. So you can use the top notch, like the category winners tools for exactly task you have, search, CMS, whatever, right? So that's the pretty cool thing. And we are naturally going to the next question, which is, so why they choose commerce tools? What makes it unique for this commerce puzzle in this whole architecture?
They choose commercetools because we are the market leader in headless commerce. We actually invented it. So Dirk Horrig, our founder and CEO, he invented headless commerce in 2013. That was a brand new category. And it's because of our architecture. We're multi-tenant, which is great because we're constantly pushing new updates to production. We release to production at least 4 times a day, and we can do even faster than that if we need to. So we're constantly publishing new functionality. Everyone's running the exact same version of our software. We guarantee backwards compatibility. We have a great extensions framework. We're fully SaaS, so there's nothing you ever need to install or run. Our commercial terms are very friendly, so we're pay per month, which is really nice. So for a lot of reasons, architecture, I mean, of course we have great features too, but it's primarily an architecture approach. We are a box of commerce tools that you can consume a la carte, in the same way that when you log into AWS or GCP or Azure, you have a big toolbox of APIs that you can choose from and bake into your applications. We do the same thing, but for commerce.
Cool.
So that's why people are choosing us. And then if you look at our competitors, they're not doing anything. They're kind of stuck in this trap because, if you're an Oracle ATG, or if you're SAP Hybris, you have 1 or 2,000 customers, or even Magento or Demandware. You have 1 or 2,000 customers who expect your product to work exactly one way. They bought it because at the time it was a single tenant SaaS, right? Or because it was on-prem. And if you're a software vendor, it becomes really, really difficult to make substantial breaking changes that force your customers to do a re-implementation. You just can't do that. So what ends up happening is they'll milk that maintenance stream out as long as they can, because if you're signed up with WebSphere Commerce, which is now owned by HCL or Oracle or SAP, you're paying 20+% of that initial price that you paid for the software every year for maintenance. So it's in their interest as a big legacy vendor to innovate around the edges, which is what they've done, and continue to milk that maintenance stream as long as they possibly can. Because as soon as they do like a Magento 1 to Magento 2 breaking upgrade, nobody updates the new version. Everyone switched to Shopify, right? And that's why you don't do that as a software vendor, because you lose your install base and you have to resell them, and it's really expensive to reacquire all those customers again. So for all those reasons, the competitors really aren't doing anything, and it's really just us right now in town. We're the only game right now. So it's a good time to be in the commerce platform space.
That I think that's a very good observation about the reasons why those platforms are evolving so slow. Actually, it makes perfect sense after what you just said. Okay, but let me ask another question. So we have commerce tools, great API. I heard a lot of good things. Halil pointed out those extendability features that are really awesome, and told us some insights how they're using it. So it's really cool. You have this API, which is actually headless, right? One of the key features is that it's headless, so it's headless without the front end. So if I'm a CTO of some merchant willing to build the end-to-end commerce, I guess I need this front end, right? So what options I have?
Yeah, you need a front end at some point. So one option, and we've obviously partnered together on this, is the Vue storefront. And that's a great accelerator, very quick time to market. We say 2 weeks, and we've had customers do that. Very easy to get started. So that's one approach, and we're big fans of what you guys have done.
PWA included.
Makes it really easy to get going.
Exactly.
So just to be clear, we as a vendor will never get into the front end ourselves. That's why we're partnering with you. Another approach is you could have a full-blown digital experience platform, something like Bloomreach or Adobe Experience Manager, or something like that, that allows you to build that whole front end from top to bottom. And we have actually quite a few customers who just build it from scratch themselves. Now, you don't get the PWA, and there are a lot of things that you don't get, but for some of our larger customers, they say, you know what, the frameworks out there don't meet our needs exactly. We want freedom. We're just going to build this from scratch ourselves. So we see a pretty broad assortment of what people do out there. It's a big mix.
Awesome. You have a lot of options, right?
Yeah.
I really like this idea of having this headless front-end application, which is kind of glue for all the other services, right? So you have this front-end, you can pick your CMS, search engine, commerce, which is commercetools probably, and other pieces, put them all together, having the e-commerce experience for your users at the level you like. So no limitations, which is really awesome. So the question is, what are the other components you see that are usually mixed up with commercetools to create those cool user experiences?
Well, obviously you need a front end of some sort. We see a lot of A/B testing solutions, so that's probably necessary. We see a lot of personalization engines, like actual machine learning based personalization engines that do that really well. Search and whole search management piece is also very important. And that kind of intersects with the whole personalization space as well. And then on the back end, we see people implementing OMSs and warehouse management systems, WMSs. We see a lot of people do headless CMSs these days. So content stack, we have a huge chunk of our customers buy content stack. Some buy contentful as well, same concept. Some buy Amplience. And there it's very much like what we're doing for commerce, they're doing for content. Same exact approach. So it's a pretty broad assortment, but again, it really depends on the organization, depends what they're doing, depends. We have some customers who just do machine to machine ordering for B2B use cases, and they don't even have a front end at all, right? Because it's a robot placing an order from a factory. So I mean, we have a very broad assortment, and then we have people selling $10,000 handbags. So it's all over the place.
Yeah, that's really cool. By the way, you just launched this marketplace, marketplace.commercetools.com, which is cool. For our listeners, you can find all those modules Kelly mentioned along with View Storefront Accelerator in there. So take your time and take a look. My next question is about the process more than the technology. So let's say you are the CTO, merchant side, and you were asked to migrate from HEG, Hybris, Magento, you name it, monolithic platform to headless architecture. What would be your first step? How you get this thing started?
Well, you start out with the strangler pattern. Well, hold on, let me step back. We have some customers, larger customers, who are primarily US based, for example, and they do all of their business in the US. But maybe they started selling in Canada, or they started selling in Mexico, or pick a smaller country. And I mean, relatively smaller, right? And we've had a number of our customers do that, and some of them do it in Europe too, where they're based in Germany, but maybe they just started selling in Cyprus, right? Just make that up. And there, what's kind of nice about that is they can implement from scratch a whole new front end, and then connect that back to us at commercetools, almost like a proof of concept or like a minimum viable product, but on us.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And typically you can do that in a couple of weeks. You learn a lot as an organization. And that's a good place to start. Nice and easy, small. And, honestly, if the Canadian site goes down and, they have 10 shoppers on the Canadian site because they just launched it, I mean, nobody really cares, right? It's
Yeah.
not going to hit the earnings statement.
Low risk. Low risk.
Very, very low risk. Yes.
Yeah.
And over time, of course, it grows. And, I have a lot of respect for my Canadian friends, but you get the picture, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Start low risk, start with their flagship.com. But again, they'll do it in a very, very small, limited fashion. So they'll take the product detail page and they'll make a copy of that page. And the one copy of that page will leverage Hybris, for example, or ATG. And then they'll make just a direct file copy of that page and they'll swap out the API calls so that it calls us at commercetools.
Gotcha.
And that approach actually works out really well because now you can do A/B testing and you can point customers to different variants of that page and just get started with that. And then after that's successful, maybe you go to the category pages and then you go to the landing pages and then you go to the user profile. It's actually the Martin Fowler strangler pattern approach. So the strangler pattern is, a pattern where you just strangle the monolith until it goes away. And we have a lot of customers who adopt that. And we actually have white papers that talk through that whole process. It's pretty well established at this point how that works.
Lower the risk, pick some, pieces of your system to do the proof of concepts or even go live, but do a lot of A/B testing before doing some huge rollout, right? That's the recipe here.
Yeah, exactly.
My next question is more about the team structure than the technology or even the process. It's based on the discussion I had last week with one of our customers who's doing the migration from monolithic platform to service-oriented, actually microservices and headless platform. And they asked me how you divide the team, how you set the scopes, how you make it efficient to work on those migration projects.
Well, it's pretty varied. So sometimes we'll see organizations, they'll hand off their legacy application to an SI, somebody who can just do basic maintenance on it. So that's one approach.
Yeah.
Another approach is to form a parallel IT team. And basically you have the legacy team, and then you start, and oftentimes it's in a different location within a building, or maybe it's even a separate building, but you now have a different team that you hire just for this new application that you're building.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can bring in an SI and just do that for that new organization, and have two SIs, one for old, one for new, right? And go back and forth. And then within the new team, what I like to see is people start being more domain focused. So if you have a 20-person IT organization, I don't think it makes sense to build 4 teams of 5 members and have them go do microservices. That probably doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But what you can do is you can have a couple people be responsible for the UI and have them be their own formal team, which is great. And then you can have maybe you'd use the word macro services, but you have one team responsible for checkout, and you have another team responsible for profile, and you have another one for product catalog. And there you start exposing granular functionality from commercetools, from third parties, from internal sources. You have them do that internally and then start exposing that functionality. But you have an organization that's built around business domains rather than built around horizontal technology layers.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we are getting back to the idea of having the functional scopes as a base for the teams in order to have them something they can deploy at different paces and different speed, right?
Yep, that's exactly it.
What's the top success factor for replatforming?
The big one I see, what makes a project successful, is if you have an empowered business executive with money who's not afraid of getting fired. You have an actual leader, and typically this person is like a chief digital officer or chief technology officer, but you have someone who's willing to say, look, we are going to do this project over the next 12 months.
Yeah.
This is roughly how it's going to work. I am willing to spend money, right? But these are the results I want to see. They knock down organizational barriers inside internally. So if there is an internal IT organization, this person has the authority to say, you know what, I'm going to let my teams go out and buy databases from GCP, right? Forget your Oracle database from 20 years ago. I'm not going to use that shared service internally.
Yep.
I'm going to allow my teams to pick the technology that works best for their needs. Right. And somebody who's really empowered, very type A personality, often somebody with authority, somebody with
Right.
money to spend, somebody who's technical and understands the business value of this. The last thing you want is a consensus driven person from the legacy IT mindset, right? An
Yeah.
old school CIO who believes in shared services, who brings in 50 different SIs, right? You need one good SI, right? You don't need 50. You don't need a big outsourcing operation where you have a whole bunch of lower skilled people. You need a smaller, more tight knit, high quality SI to bring in, and you need one or two of those SIs. You don't need a whole bunch of them. So if you have somebody who really gets how this new world works and isn't just trying to apply these early 2000s BPO or ITO practices
Yeah.
to today's approach, I think you're going to be much more successful.
So is the opposite of that, like some dispersed responsibility, being bound to 90s like IT management style, the top failure factor, or is it something different?
I think the top failure factor is similar. It's just a lack of commitment at the senior levels of the organization.
Okay.
And I mean, to get to the point of doing a replatforming says a lot. We have dealt with a lot of prospects, and this is happening less, but it used to be a thing where picture there's a company in Illinois that I visited a few times, and it stuck with me a lot. So we're in a final pitch for commercetools, and I don't do a lot of customer um, involvement, but
Yeah.
I'm not too far, and they asked if I could come in and talk to the CIO, and they literally had the IBM Webster Commerce rep in the meeting.
Okay. Yeah.
And it turns out, in chatting between between our sessions, that the CIO is best friends with the IBM rep. They go to steak dinners every 2 weeks. You see a lot of capture by these big legacy vendors
Yes.
where
Yeah.
the CIOs get very comfortable. They might also be older. They might be in their early 60s and have retirement a couple of years out,
Yeah.
and they don't want to upset anyone.
Yeah.
They get paid to do the same thing year in and year out, a little bit better. They go to their monthly dinners with IBM or Oracle or SAP sales reps.
Yeah.
They renew their ULAs, year in and year out. They keep renewing them. And they're paid basically to do the same thing over and over and make marginal small improvements and not upset anyone.
Yeah.
Right? That's what they're incentivized to do.
They are trying to avoid the risk at all costs.
And a lot of people, again, if you're the CIO of a multinational company, you're close to retirement, the very last thing you want to do, and I wouldn't want to do this either. If I'm retiring in 2 years, the very last thing I'd want to do is embark on a 2-year project that's has a likelihood of failure,
Yeah.
right? If I'm not managing
Yeah.
it, it's going to keep me up all the time. Right? It's a lot of work to go do that. It's the equivalent of open heart surgery in some of these big organizations to go swap out your commerce platform. So the very last thing you want to do is go out and finish your career with a potential failure.
Yeah.
What you want is somebody who's ambitious and somebody who's not afraid of getting fired, and somebody who has a long time left and wants to build a legacy. That's what you want in that position. And I've seen, plenty of people who are close to retirement do crazy things, good things too. Don't get me wrong. It's not an age thing. It's a mindset thing. right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
people who are just old and familiar. I mean, familiar with that old approach of technology and aren't willing to make that change and are comfortable with their legacy vendors.
Yeah, that was a good point. Like, it's all about the change
It's
management
mindset more than
mindset.
anything.
Yeah. Cool. So maybe let's switch to some product API related questions. In our recent interview, Halil from LoveCrafts pointed out the way APIs are structured change a lot. Like, he said something like, if you have this legacy monolithic platform, probably it has some crude API, so create, read, update, delete operations based on some kind of entity granulation kind of structure, and it's totally don't scale, right? It don't scale. It's not for modern web anymore, not for building headless front end. I can totally agree with that. Like, at Vue Storefront, we have the same challenges. Integrating some platforms is much easier than others. On your side, what's the biggest challenge designing this great API? Like, what is the great API, and how you design it?
The biggest challenge I see with people designing APIs is they write their code and then they expose it through an API.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And that's the exact opposite. And we at commercetools have always been API first. So we design the API from the perspective of, if I'm a developer, how do I want to interact with this API? Right? What's optimal for me as a developer?
Yeah.
And then we write the spec, and we actually use RAML internally. And then we implement the the code to support that API. If you do it the other way around, you end up with all sorts of weird things in your APIs, and it just doesn't work very well. So that's the number one challenge I see.
Yeah. commercetools is API first cloud-based platform. API is great. I heard a lot of stories how easy it is to work with it. But how can you customize cloud-based platform? Like, in many cases, you need to customize the order flow, the way you integrate with the ERP or other systems. Even the front end sometimes requires changes to the API, to how feature works. How can you achieve this in cloud-based platform?
So you can change the data model on the fly.
Yeah.
And that's pretty straightforward. So if you're selling shoes, you can add a shoe size property. You can add custom types, custom objects. So the data model is completely flexible, and that's because we're built on top of MongoDB behind the scenes. So we have a document database.
Yeah.
And because it's document, it's not a fixed rigid schema like you'd find with a traditional relational database. So you can add, change whatever you want there. We also event data out. So traditional platforms you would use like JMS or some point-to-point messaging, very low volume. What we do at commercetools is you can specify the queue that you would like us to dump the messages, and then you can specify the types of messages you'd like us to send. So every time you touch an order object, or every time you place an order, every time you create a product or delete a product, right, you can register these hooks, and we'll dump an event out to SNS or SQS or Google PubSub, or take your pick of high volume actual eventing platform. We'll dump that out there for you.
Yeah.
And then an example is you could write and this is what differentiates us in part from some of the legacy platforms. I'll give you an example with order confirmation emails. We might not have every single feature. We're probably 90% feature complete compared to the other platforms. But an example of that is we don't automatically send out thank you for your order emails after the order is placed. And that's because we have customers who do lots of different things. Not everybody wants that functionality.
Sure. Yeah.
So what we do instead is we'll event out an event that says, hey, this customer's placed this order. You could then write a Lambda function or a custom application, or whatever you want to grab that event and then send the customer a thank you email. So imagine doing it from a Lambda function. That's 5 lines of JavaScript that you would do, or pick your language.
Gotcha. Yeah.
It becomes really, really easy to then just register that function, bind that to that event, and send the customer the email. So that's really easy to do. You can also take serverless functions like Google Cloud Functions or AWS Lambda functions, and you can inject them into our platform. And we actually have a patent pending on that. So that's something that only we've done. But you can change internally how commercetools works by injecting these functions at runtime,
That's
which is
awesome.
pretty impressive.
That's awesome. So you can even change how the admin panel works, like adding some behaviors.
Yeah, we have what's called it's a merchant center. A merchant center is for business users.
Yeah.
And then there you can create custom applications, they're called. So you can plug things into our nav bar and you can go there and manage. Yeah, you can manage those.
Wow, it's pretty cool. So it seems for me like the old way where you had the platform and you were building the modules for adding some Java, PHP, whatever plugins evolved, and now you have the serverless instead of that, and basically the same capabilities and the same options for extending the platform, but way safer, easier, and probably faster because you can deploy those services totally separately, right?
Right. It's completely different. So the way it used to work is you almost had to be like a brain surgeon and know exactly how the commerce platform worked. So if you wanted to customize that, thank you for your order email, you'd have to go into a Hybris or ATG. It was done in exactly one place. And it was really, there was one place you would do that. So you had to have a lot of knowledge on internally how the platform worked.
Certificated developers.
Yep. And exactly. And, you'd go out and you look for Demandware developers or Hybris developers. You couldn't just take regular developers. With us and, with other applications that are similar to us in the future, the complexity is on the outside. It's not on the inside. So we have really nicely well-defined APIs. It's very easy to customize those. But your extensions and customizations and everything else live in the cloud. So they actually live as serverless functions or third-party applications. It's a completely different approach. So your functionality is on the outside, which is a lot easier. So it's not so tightly coupled, which is what you want.
I've read your last book on GraphQL. Maybe let's switch to GraphQL for a while. The book is a really good one. That's one thing. Why do you think GraphQL is so important? I know that you already have the support. We are using it in ViewStore for Next. Pretty cool. Why is it so important? And maybe you can give us some 3 most important features for you find in the standard.
Maybe it would be good for me to explain what GraphQL is for those who aren't aware.
Sure.
It's something that Facebook developed. As Facebook was rebuilding their apps in 2015, they had the challenge of overfetching with their APIs. So they would call an API and it would give them too much data. Another one was underfetching, where they'd call an API, but it wouldn't give them enough data. So they'd have to make multiple calls. They also had an issue with discoverability. So not being able to find out what APIs existed across Facebook. Because in many enterprises, you'll have 5 different APIs, each claiming to have the latest inventory information, for example, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of overlap and it's hard to discover these things. And then also another problem with REST is REST does not really have standards. So REST is a style, it's not a specification. And that creates problems. So Facebook, in redesigning this, they actually came up with this thing they called GraphQL. They called it SuperGraph originally, but now it's called GraphQL. And think of it almost as like a database query, but across your APIs. So you can specify, I would like the product, I'll give you an example of a page that's important here, like the product detail page.
Yeah.
So to render that traditionally, and there are tricks you can do, we have reference expansions and other things, but to render a product detail page, you need to call the product API, you need to call pricing, you need to call inventory, you need to call an API to make sure that that product is for sale right now and that it can be added to the shopping cart. You need to call content APIs. You need to call a whole bunch of different APIs to render that. and that can become burdensome. With GraphQL, you just issue a query and you say query, and then you say product ID equals X. And then you say, for this product, I would like its name, I'd like its content, I would like its inventory, I'd like its price, I'd like the flag on if it's able to be added to a shopping cart, right? I need all of those pieces of information, basically. And I need them all back in one query. So as a developer, you just make the query, you issue it, and then that GraphQL layer then calls all of the REST APIs themselves and then retrieves data back to you as the client. So it's much more optimized than plain REST APIs. And again, REST APIs are great. They work really well. But what we're seeing is almost all without exception of our new customers signed in the last year are using GraphQL exclusively. And it's because it makes so much sense. But GraphQL has been used by Twitter now for 6 years, 5 years it's been used by. So every tweet goes through GraphQL. New York Times has used it. AWS is a big supporter of it. It's really emerged as a complement to REST APIs, not a replacement for. And the takeaways, I think what's really important, it's a very well-defined specification.
Okay.
So it's very, very, very specific, which is good because it means that clients and servers can each evolve independently. There's a lot of interoperability. So I think that's really important. I think it's also a very flexible standard. So that's probably the second feature I find. You can model things exactly how you want. And the third is I really like, and it's in the title, but it's GraphQL. So it's graph.
Yeah.
So you can query, customer.orders, and then for each of the orders, you can look at the products. So you can have hierarchical queries. You can have them be they can reference each other. Like it's a big graph, and you can query whatever you want across the entire graph all in one query. And having that is really powerful. And if you think about it, a social network like Facebook is basically a graph, right?
Yeah.
Hence the name GraphQL for query language. So we can do the same thing, but for commerce. And commerce is just a big graph as well. You have customers and orders and products, and they all have relationships, and it becomes a big graph that you can then query.
So you think it will at some point replace the will be this, maybe not replace, maybe it's not about replacing, but it will become the master data management platform for everything? Because I find this feature you just mentioned a few seconds ago, that you can do this huge graph having REST, SQL, other data sources all mashed up to a single schema, really powerful. Do you think that this is how it will be like managing the data in 2 years from now?
It's possible. It's unlikely because GraphQL is built for, and it's best for north-south communication. So if you look at a data center, north-south is from a data center out to a customer.
Yeah.
That's north-south. It's building a website. It's building Facebook.com, whatever that is. East-west is within a data center. It's the CRM to the ERP system integration.
Right.
GraphQL is really optimized for north-south. It is not at all optimized for east-west. Another challenge with GraphQL is it can suffer the same fate as SOA, which is you end up with too much intelligence in the pipes, and then you end up with very tight coupling.
And the pipes are the resolvers and this whole federation into different data sources, right?
It can get very complicated very quickly. Yeah. So my preference is, and what we see it being used as, is more of a north-south thing, where there's very, very little, if any, logic in those pipes, and the resolvers are very clean, and all they do is just call an API and filter out data. And I think that's a really good approach. I mean, maybe in the future, companies like Apollo, which is a big vendor in that space, will maybe do more work around east-west, which is great. But for the time being, it's all north-south, and I would stick with it as that for the time being.
Awesome. Okay, Kelly, thanks for the answers, for your time. That was really interesting talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a good discussion. We'll have to do it over beer next time.
Yeah, sure. So to our listeners, please feel free to ask any questions you wanted in the comments. We'll try to answer. And see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks.